welcome to the inaugural episode of the Dorian Daily Podcast. I'm tremendously excited to be starting this podcast, and I hope that we can all share some valuable information and learn and grow and have various insights into fields such as law, business, economics, politics, philosophy, and history. Today, we're going to be starting the conversation off on a historical level, but also political and economic insight into the country of Côte d'Ivoire. For those who don't know, Côte d'Ivoire is a country in the west of Africa and was a former French colony. They are actually the world's largest supplier of cocoa. So anybody who eats chocolate, either indirectly or directly, you are dealing with the country of Côte d'Ivoire, who holds over 70% of the world's cocoa supply. They're also very renowned for their association football talent. Great players such as DJ Drogba of Chelsea, or Yaya Touré of Manchester City, or Serge Aurier of Paris Saint-Germain, now Tottenham, all come from the country of Côte d'Ivoire. And beyond that, it's just a fascinating story of economic growth turned into, sadly, a brutal civil war. And today the country is in a much better situation, but the purpose of this conversation today is really to look at the trajectory from post-independence up until the Civil War, which started in the 21st century, and now how things have gotten back on the right path for Côte d'Ivoire into the second decade of the 21st century. So without any further ado, which I've recently learned that phrase in and of itself is ado, but I digress. I present to you the story of Côte d'Ivoire in an essay titled Scarcity, Autonomy, and Hegemony, a multi-causal analysis of the Ivorian crisis. The story of Côte d'Ivoire is one of rapid economic growth driven by a neighborly fraternité that turned into economic retrogression driven by what's amounted to an exclusionary ultranationalism. For decades, Côte d'Ivoire was the favored colony of the French in West Africa, and its richly endowed natural resource sector attracted both Europeans and Africans alike. The country's expansive post-independence growth made it the fastest growing country, not just in Africa, but the world, for the span of 2 decades. This growth was coupled with mass immigration from neighboring countries, political stability bolstered by a one-party rule, economic integration with large export markets, and a general tolerance for ethnic and religious differences which made up the citizenry. However, when the economic fortune of the nation changed in the 1980s, so too did much of the populace's support for endorsing open immigration and policy of neighborly fraternité. After over a decade of economic decline, brought on by a number of factors including various structural adjustment programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund, the country experienced a fate all too similar to other countries in sub-Saharan Africa and fell victim to a military coup in 1999. For over a decade, into the turn of the millennium, the political situation in Côte d'Ivoire became increasingly polarized, and the country that had been peaceful for so long was marred by an internal north-south divide and violent armed conflict. To fully understand the Ivorian crisis, it is vital to comprehend not just the decisions made by the contemporary actors involved, but the historical context which underpins their actions. The reason being is that the Ivorian crisis is oftentimes portrayed using a number of simplifying frameworks. For instance, some common explanations propose the country's open immigration policy begot xenophobia, ultranationalism grew out of the transition into multipartism, which could not be dealt with given the weak democratic institutions, structural adjustment programs forced government spending cuts, which disrupted patronage networks and aggravated dormant cleavages, France's desire to maintain its hegemony within the region exacerbated the conflict, and/or the conflict was an inevitable result of the extended one-party rule. All of these explanations are fully viable to a certain extent. However, they are not sufficient in and of themselves to explain the civil conflict. The reality of the situation in Côte d'Ivoire is that the historical, ethnic, religious, economic, political, and colonial narratives all have to be understood in tandem to fully appreciate the fruition and causes of the Civil War. Furthermore, by virtue of the fact the Ivorian conflict is a multidimensional struggle, it ought to be explained from a multi-causal perspective. The purpose of my discussion today is to analyze the conflict from the multi-causal perspective that it warrants. Rather than provide a chronological recap of the conflict followed by an interpretive analysis, I'll be trying to organize the relevant thematic sections as they relate to the conflict. Being analyzed is the Ivorian miracle, the economic breakdown in the 1980s, the end of Félix Houphouët-Boigny's one-party rule and subsequent democratic transition, the ethnic grievances that came to the forefront of the political agenda when the notion of ivorité was introduced in the national political discourse, the social construction of an autonomous Ivorian people, and autonomous just simply means like indigenous or indigenité, and the issue of citizenship, which was a central theme in the conflict. Ultimately, it will be argued that the conflict in Côte d'Ivoire was a multidimensional struggle, whereby both state and non-state actors sought to increase their appropriation of the political and economic sphere. What prolonged the conflict was a fundamental disagreement over who was Ivorian, and deserved the benefits that came with that distinction, and who was an étranger, or a stranger, residing in Côte d'Ivoire just to reap the economic benefits. The theories used to substantiate the argument will be manifold. In the first place, the theory of post-coloniality and the desire of France to maintain their hegemony within the region will be used to explain their involvement. A social constructivist theory will be used to explain the ultranationalist movement that occurred toward the end of the 20th century. Furthermore, power transition theory will be used to explain the botched transformation into a multi-party state, but first, a historical background into the country is necessary. Côte d'Ivoire was developed first and foremost as a plantation economy. For decades before independence, cash crops introduced by the French, such as coffee and cocoa, served to satisfy the colony's domestic market demands. This vastly grew the size of Côte d'Ivoire's export sector, and one truly cannot underestimate the role cocoa came to play as a catalyst in the Ivorian economic, political, and social sphere. Statistically speaking, cocoa made up as much as 1/4 of Côte d'Ivoire's gross domestic product on any given year. As one scholar describes the French colonial enterprise's investment in the cocoa sector, it was the fulcrum of the economy and its adaptation as Côte d'Ivoire's developmental strategy brought about by social forces whose transformatory impact have manifest in many social and political challenges that have beset the country. What is meant by this is the development of the cocoa sector transcended mere economic activity and became an all-encompassing feature of Ivorian life. Côte d'Ivoire quickly became the leading producer of cocoa in the world, and the livelihood of much of its people became dependent on this crop. Today, they remain the leading producer in the cocoa crop. When the nation became fully independent in 1960, the first president and father of the nation was Félix Houphouët-Boigny, a politician who had ample economic experience in the plantation sector and political experience in the French National Assembly. As one scholar explains, Boigny built on his political prominence in the 1940s and 50s as the founder of the African Agricultural Union, which sought to establish fair prices for exporting African agriculturalists. Boigny used this clout to help get elected to the French National Assembly, whereby at the time they always had representatives from the various colonies in Africa and beyond. And once there, Houphouët-Boigny was instrumental in abolishing the much despised colonial practice of forced labor. Despite the seemingly pro-African agenda, Boigny was thoroughly in favor of maintaining a strong relationship with France. As one observer suggests, Boigny built his country's prosperity by reinforcing the former colonial relationship in every sphere, including military treaties, economic, political, and cultural affairs. Essentially, independence involved hardly more than the raising of a new flag in Côte d'Ivoire. The relationship undermined the preferred policy of those who advocated for a pan-Africanism, a policy stance that sought to further integrate African nations independent of the colonial powers, in favor of what is known as a Franc-Afrique. The Franc-Afrique policy established by Boigny kept close ties with the motherland and linked French business interests with African heads of state. It is important to note that this close relationship meant that France had never lost its deeply vested interest in Côte d'Ivoire from either an economic or political perspective. Furthermore, under the Accord d'assistance militaire technique, the French were still physically present insofar as their military were to be stationed in Côte d'Ivoire and responsible for its protection. Despite the grievances of many nationalists who preferred to see a weakened French influence post-independence, the relationship was by no means detrimental for the Ivorian economy. From 1960 to 1980, the gross domestic product per capita in Côte d'Ivoire grew from $157.2 US dollars to $1,231 US dollars, making Côte d'Ivoire the fastest growing economy in the world during that time frame. Even more impressive is the fact that the per capita growth rate was coupled with massive population growth simultaneously. Côte d'Ivoire went from 3.47 million inhabitants in 1960 to 8.26 million in 1980. Economists dubbed this period the Ivorian Miracle, and it was principally driven by the production in the cocoa sector. By virtue of the fact cocoa production is a highly labor-intensive practice, its export rates were largely dependent on the availability and supply of laborers. To reach the country's full production potential, Félix Houphouët-Boigny came to the realization that an open immigration policy would best serve the demand for workers. People from all over West Africa, such as neighboring Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, Liberia, Ghana, and others, were allowed to come to work in the Côte d'Ivoire as they pleased, and reap the benefits of the Ivorian economic miracle. As one scholar notes, foreigners, most of them Voltaic-speaking migrant agricultural workers from impoverished Burkina Faso, accounted for 26% of the people who now live in Côte d'Ivoire. This gives the nation one of the highest immigration rates in the entire world. This was in large part due to the fact the system operated by Félix Houphouët-Boigny was one where almost anyone could obtain Ivorian nationality documents if they were able to pay for them. Boigny not only adopted an open immigration policy, he adopted a policy of mise en valeur, which, as he describes it, purports "La terre appartient à celui qui la cultive," which means the land belongs to those who cultivate it. It was this policy that was so attractive to people from neighboring countries because it provided a sense that, contrary to some of their homelands, they would be able to keep the fruits of their labor and not have it expropriated by the government. The reason the Ivorian miracle is so instrumental to fully understanding the civil conflict is because it was this period of economic growth which led so many people immigrating to Côte d'Ivoire. The importance lie not just in the fact that Côte d'Ivoire is significantly inhabited by immigrants, as aforementioned, over 1/4 of the population are foreign-born, but that the nation is non-homogeneous. Christians, Muslims, and indigenous people are all present, and none of them make up a demographic majority. Likewise, there are 5 major cultural clusters: Akan, Kru, Northern Mande, Southern Mande, and Gur, none of whom form a majority either. As one scholar notes, a consequence of this massive state-sponsored migration was that in most villages in the cocoa-growing region, the native or autochtone populations were outnumbered. With that being said, it is important to keep in mind ethnic and religious diversity does not necessarily make conflict more likely. Some would argue there is a positive to this diverse demographic composition insofar as politics had to be deferential, it had to be pragmatic, and absorbative of the thoughts and political visions of multiple groups in order to fully leverage the vast potential of the Ivorian miracle. The policies adopted by Houphouët-Boigny did not discriminate against religion or ethnicity, but gave preference to whomever contributed to the nation's productivity. Another argument along the same line of thinking, that there is a causal relationship between demographic shifts and political dynamics, suggests that at the sub-state level, violence is most likely to follow rather than precede a demographic shift, because most ethnic groups will not advance claims to greater economic, social, or political autonomy until they constitute a majority either within the larger state or within a given territory. It begs the question of whether Côte d'Ivoire truly formed a sovereign nation, or if it was just an economic hub for West Africa and France. It has been argued that the implication of Houphouët-Boigny's policies during the miracle was that the distinction between foreigners and nationals simply made no sense. This posits that Ivorians were who President Bonnet said they were, and anyone who wanted to work for the benefit of themselves and the Ivorian economy would be welcomed with open arms, a truly neighborly fraternité. If this is truly the case, as many believe, inhabitants of Côte d'Ivoire chose to not really think of themselves through a lens of nationalist identity, but rather bounded by their regional enclaves or in terms of their relative proximity to French culture. Moreover, as long as the economy continued to grow and Côte d'Ivoire's standard of living was rising, citizens could look beyond the ethnic, cultural, and religious differences in the nationality. Unfortunately, developing the bulk of the national economy around a single primary resource made Côte d'Ivoire highly susceptible to volatile external markets and fluctuations in commodity prices. The exponential number of Ivorians employed in the cocoa sector experienced firsthand this economic phenomena when there was a shock in the cocoa market in the late 1970s. This sent resounding externalities throughout the Ivorian economy. In just 1 year, from 1980 to 1981, Côte d'Ivoire's gross domestic product fell by approximately 17%. This enormous GDP reduction proved especially staggering for the 40% of the Ivorian workforce that was employed by the state, either directly through the subsidies that undergird the cocoa sector or indirectly through patronage networks. As one economist notes, the fact the minor fluctuation was enough to plunge the country into an economic crisis reveals the instability endemic to state-led systems that rely on a small number of agricultural products. The scholar's criticism addresses the fact that by virtue of the primary resource sector being state-led, this made Côte d'Ivoire even more susceptible to external market shocks insofar as they were not responsive or efficient to deal with the declines in the commodity prices. In 1981, faced with severe economic decline and scant alternatives, the Ivorian government turned to the International Monetary Fund and signed their first structural adjustment agreement. As aforementioned, the state was intricately embedded in the Ivorian economy through investment, agricultural subsidies, patronage networks, and social spending. Under the auspices of the International Monetary Fund, which sought to pursue sound macroeconomic policy, Côte d'Ivoire was forced to make extensive cuts and inefficient allocation of resources, such as social spending and agricultural investment. Furthermore, the extensive network of political patronage had to be cut. The importance of cuts to state spending cannot be overemphasized. While economists will disagree over whether or not state spending is an efficient way to stimulate overall economic growth, a laissez-faire versus Keynesian debate, the agricultural boom in Côte d'Ivoire was made possible by it. Now, instead of spending, Côte d'Ivoire was taking on massive loans from the International Monetary Fund, which led not only to significant debt, but an exodus of foreign capital. The Ivorian miracle turned into the Ivorian nightmare in a mere 2 decades. While the country was forced to take on loans, matters were only worsened by the fact cocoa prices continued to decline, going from an average of $3,000 per metric ton in the late 1970s to as low as $1,100 in the early 1990s. So what does the role of the IMF during this period matter for the outbreak of the Ivorian Civil War? As one empirical study on the IMF's structural adjustment programs found, these programs systematically create winners and losers, altering opportunity costs in such a manner as to motivate the latter to engage in civil conflict. What this argument suggests is that IMF imposes policies alter the domestic economic incentive structure in such a way that some actors will consider extra-legal, in this case violent, means to recuperate their previous position in the domestic sphere. A further explanation posits that the extensive patronage networks and agricultural subsidies are what mitigated dormant regional, ethnic, and religious cleavages during the time of economic prosperity. When the economy was no longer growing and the state's available resources for social spending programs vanished, there was no longer an incentive for groups, be they Muslim, Christian, Baoulé, Bete, or Sinofo, to be as accepting of each other's presence as they once were in the times of economic growth and prosperity. The increasingly growing Ivorian population ultimately saw a decreasing share of resources, and someone had to be blamed. As one narrative documents, the perception of some Ivorians when they came back to their villages It was that they saw their fathers were poor while the foreigners were rich. Obviously, not all foreigners were rich, and many were feeling the same economic hardship as those born in Côte d'Ivoire. With that being said, throughout the course of history, it has been in times of severe economic despair that begets cries from the polity to find a scapegoat. For many Ivorians, this scapegoat was the foreigners allowed into the country during the miracle. By virtue of the fact a significant number of these foreigners were Muslims, mostly from Burkina Faso, this brought about a scarcity-induced xenophobia soon to be exploited politically. What was meant as a short-term solution by the IMF became policy for an extended period of time. Public backlash against these austerity programs was resounding, and in some cases there were violent protests. Toward the end of the 1980s, rising dissent made it obvious that President Houphouët-Boigny was going to have to open up the Ivorian political system. Up until this time, Houphouët-Boigny, representing the Parti démocratique de la Côte d'Ivoire, won each presidential election uncontested and solidified himself as the absolute ruler of the one-man, one-party state. Criticism arising from the repression of political opposition was minuscule during the time of economic prosperity. But with economic decline, followed by over a decade of stagnation, pressure for democratization increased. With both domestic actors and international donors calling for it, Côte d'Ivoire held its first multi-party election in 1990. However, much to the chagrin of those opposed to Houphouët-Boigny, opposition parties were poorly organized, and the incumbent won with an 81.68% share of the popular vote. Although Houphouët-Boigny won with a resounding majority, the die had been cast, and the citizenry had full expectation that multipartism would be fully solidified in the next election. Moreover, Houphouët-Boigny was now over 80 years of age, and the governing responsibilities were increasingly falling upon his prime minister, Alassane Ouattara, a former director of the African Department at the International Monetary Fund, who was appointed 1 month after the election in November of 1990. In 1993, after months of treatment in a French hospital, the father of the nation and Côte d'Ivoire's first and only president passed away. As one scholar notes of the seismic event, virtually all ambitious members of the political elite saw his death as an opportunity to cast themselves as his successor. Despite claims to power by Prime Minister Ouattara, Article 11 of the Ivorian Constitution, which was revised by Houphouët-Boigny, stipulated that the President of the National Assembly was to be named his successor. At the time, the President of the National Assembly was Henry Konan Bedie, who, like Houphouët-Boigny, was an ethnic Baoulé. After a brief struggle for power with Prime Minister Ouattara, Bedie was recognized as the president, and Ouattara chose to leave the Parti démocratique de la Côte d'Ivoire. It is of great importance to know that the Baoulé ethnic group had successfully maintained hegemonic control of the political executive throughout the entirety of Côte d'Ivoire's independence. However, with the populist leader of the nation gone, the political scene became increasingly contested by other groups, and there was innumerable domestic actors that sought to break the Baoulé hegemony. In an effort to protect his group's position, Bedie began to appeal to citizenship as a form of national social cohesion, which was the first time this had happened in the nation's independent history. Recall that during the Ivorian miracle, there was little distinction between citizen and foreigner. Now, there was suddenly an impulse to identify who was who. As one caller comments on this development, abundance may soothe tensions, while scarcity can exacerbate divisions. Thus, the combination of scarcity with political pluralism created incentives to exploit and expand divisions within the electorate. President Bedie fully understood the need to leverage nationalistic appeals to solidify a distinct political prominence amongst the electorate. Consequently, he introduced the concept of ivorité. In essence, ivorité can be understood as an effort to redefine the nation in the image of its pure southern population. Bedie sought to appeal to the group of pure autochthonous Ivorians who perceived that they were supposed to have higher standing in the polity by virtue of the fact they were not foreigners or descendants of persons from other nations. To put it bluntly, Bedie's concept of ivorité profoundly reinforced the idea of territorialized autonomy as the ground upon which citizenship should be construed. This was a far cry from Houphouët-Boigny's encouragement of foreigners to come and go, work, hold property, and think of themselves as Ivorian. All of a sudden, there were entire segments of the northern region being accused of illegal immigrant status. Bédié even made it so that no one who had foreign-born parents would be allowed to participate in subsequent presidential elections, even if they were born in Côte d'Ivoire. If one were to ask Bédié the intended purposes of introducing the concept of ivorité and amending the presidential qualifications to fit his autochthonous or indigenous agenda, he would argue it was to foster a sense of national cohesion that had long been elusive within Côte d'Ivoire. However, the timing of such an appeal, during continued economic stagnation and an election coming up, seemed highly suspicious. Many saw that the juxtaposition and called out Bédié for trying to cast aspersions on the legitimacy of his main competitor, Ouattara, by suggesting that he was born of foreign parents. At the time, the former Prime Minister Ouattara was quickly mobilizing support for his new party, the Rassemblement des Républicains. Ouattara himself, a Muslim, was born in Côte d'Ivoire and favored by many due to his IMF experience. However, many speculated that his parents were from Burkina Faso. When the matter went to the Supreme Court, the judge ruled Ouattara, as per the amended presidential requirements, would be disqualified from the 1995 election. Moreover, a great number of inhabitants who were born outside or even within Côte d'Ivoire were losing citizenship rights through disenfranchisement as a result of the new need to provide documentation proving one was Ivorian. For many, such papers were non-existent. The great irony of the situation is that people claiming to be pure Ivorians were in some cases actually in the territory for a shorter period of time than those they accused of being étrangers or strangers. As one Dozo of the Malinke ethnic group put it, his people had been in Côte d'Ivoire since the 12th century, and soon they'll be given a foreign resident card to be able to live there. The fact a group of people whose ancestors had been inhabiting the territory for centuries had been accused of not fitting the bill of ivorité is a testament to the absurdity of Bédié's appeal. Moreover, Bédié's own ethnic group had only been in the territory since the 18th century when they moved from neighboring Ghana. As one scholar puts it, the individual who claims his ivorité believes themselves as belonging to one of the autochthonous ethnic groups. However, as is evident in the aforementioned example, autochthony is a contested concept on the sole basis that social facts change. The theory that helps to explain this disagreement over who was a pure citizen and the political polarization that came with it is social constructivism. In essence, social constructivism suggests that there are purposive efforts of individuals and groups to change social understandings. In this Ivorian case, Bédié was trying to change people's social belief about who was a true citizen, and his definition was vastly different from that of his predecessor. As one scholar puts it, this social construction of national identity evolved out of colonialism, migration, and cultural ties that defy national boundaries. Both the predominantly Muslim North and Christian South could accuse each other of being less Ivorian. Northerners by suggesting that the Southerners gave up their indigenous culture in favor of a French one, and Southerners by suggesting that the Muslim North did not represent Côte d'Ivoire but neighboring nations religiously and ethnically. Bédié won the 1995 election in large part due to his exclusionary tactics, which saw arguably the best candidate, Ouattara, disqualified. In protest, the two main opposition parties, Laurent Gbagbo's Front Populaire Ivoirien and Ouattara's Rassemblement des Républicains, boycotted the election. Despite significant criticism from both the domestic polity and the international community, Bédié assumed office. The president's politics continued to be exclusionary to the point that he replaced many devoted and highly respected technocrats of northern origin with persons belonging to the president's own Baoulé group who were perceived as less competent or unqualified. Furthermore, Bédié began threatening the long-established economic interests of France by opening up the cocoa sector to American investment. With grievances increasingly mounting, a military coup was organized and deposed Bédié from office in 1999 on the allegation that he was embezzling state finances. This was the first coup in Côte d'Ivoire's history and was led on behalf of retired military general Robert Guillet. In an effort to legitimize his claim to office, Guillet promised to hold an election in 2000. However, this did not legitimize him as a leader insofar as all of the major opposition candidates were still barred from contesting the election. The election resulted in Guillet illegitimately claiming himself as the victor. As a result, violent protests occurred throughout the nation, which led Guillet to cede his claim to the presidency and Laurent Gbagbo to be sworn in. When the leader of the Front Populaire Ivoirien took power, the exclusionary political policies based on ivorité did not cease to exist. Contrary to what some expected, Gbagbo utilized much of the same exclusionary tactics as Bédié. Although Gbagbo differed from his two predecessors in that he was not a Baoulé, rather a Bété, he was similar in respect to the fact he was both Catholic and a Southerner, thus fitting the bill of a quote-unquote pure Ivorian. Gbagbo's government even tried to implement a new identification process based on the political ideology of autonomy, a policy that many would think came from Bédié's desk. Although technically a democratically elected leader, only 1.79 million people of the 16.5 million living in Côte d'Ivoire were able to cast their votes. For those excluded groups, foreseeing that Gbagbo was not the one to address their political grievances and re-enfranchise them, tensions continued to rise. Ultimately, a number of armed military forces mutinied and staged a coup on the 19th of September 2002. The coup effort was unsuccessful and failed to depose Gbagbo. However, the rebels successfully took control of the northern part of the country. Sporadic violence continued for a month while the French, still stationed in Côte d'Ivoire as per the Accord d'assistance militaire technique and UN, maintained a buffer zone between the northern rebel-held and southern government-controlled territories. In October, a ceasefire was reached, and peace negotiations started in Marcoussis, France, all while the country remained partitioned into two entities. The second military coup would not have come as a surprise to some. As Paul Collier argues, once a country has had a coup, it is much more likely to have further coups. To explain this phenomena, and explain why Côte d'Ivoire experienced more political instability in under a decade than it had in the previous three, the theory of power transition proves extremely useful. Power transition theory was conceptualized by political scientist Abramo Orginsky, who argues that peace is preserved best when there is an imbalance of national capabilities. Furthermore, it is the weaker rather than the stronger power that is most likely to be the aggressor to the existing dynamic. As another power transition theorist stipulates, conflict is most likely, of the longest duration and greatest magnitude, when a challenger of the dominant power is dissatisfied with the existing system. While these particular explanations of power transition are used to explain state behavior, it can just as easily be used to explain sub-state actors' behavior. Essentially, what power transition suggests of the Ivorian conflict is that during the period of time when the Baoulé hegemony was solidified, when they were the stronger power in the political sphere, peace was prevalent within the state. However, their hegemony disintegrated with the passing of Houphouët-Boigny. Other groups that were previously weaker saw the opportunity to alter the power dynamic. Bédié tried to maintain his group's position, but he was ultimately unsuccessful, and the weaker groups in the political sphere were able to increase their clout. As one scholar notes, in the Ivorian crisis, regime change implied transition from one hegemon to another, whereby everyone just takes up arms to monopolize access to the common treasury. This posits the power transition that was occurring at the executive level represented a zero-sum game, whereby the gains of one group, Bédié, Baoulé, Burkinab, Senofo, or what have you, would represent a loss for the others. The ethnic group holding executive power truly has the dominant authority to establish the rules of the game. Domestic strife aside, many Ivorians saw the civil war as more than an internal struggle. It was seen as a deuxième guerre d'indépendance. As aforementioned, France maintained hegemonic control throughout Côte d'Ivoire by virtue of various agreements signed during Houphouët-Boigny's reign. When ultranationalist discourse entered into the political sphere, France felt immediately threatened, and when subsequent violence spread, France was already stationed in the country, obligated to resolve the situation. Many Ivorians, such as the influential pro-Gbagbo youth group turned militia, Les Jeunes Patriotes, were not satisfied with the decision of their parents to retain close ties with France. As the leader of the Young Patriots, Mamadou Coulibaly, said, "To say they're here to keep the peace is to ridicule the international community's intelligence. They're here to organize coups. Ivorians such as Koulibaly thought themselves better served with closer relations to the United States, amongst other actors. These same people accused the French of protecting the rebel forces by virtue of the fact they blocked the Ivorian military, those still loyal to Gbagbo, from advancing to the north of the country. In a way, France was the only force that was capable of preventing Gbagbo from reuniting the country by force. Whether their involvement represented a deuxième guerre d'indépendance, a second war of independence, or not, the reality of the situation is that France's economic and geostrategic interests were threatened when ultranationalist discourse divided the polity. Ultimately, France was obligated under earlier treaties to mediate the civil conflict, and this is what begot cries of neo-colonialism. There is no doubt France had ulterior economic and political interest which transcended mere treaty obligations. With that being said, France's spearheading of the civil conflict resolution ought to be understood as a role propagated by the multidimensional struggle for the appropriation of the multinational Ivorian state. The attempted peace accord in France culminated in the Linus-Marcoussis Agreement. The agreement included many prototypical elements of internationally mediated peace accords for African conflicts, including power sharing, disarmament, reconciliation, and free elections. However, given the fundamental issue at stake was one of citizenship, many in Côte d'Ivoire had a hard time seeing how an externally imposed arrangement could provide a solution. Unfortunately, the skepticism was warranted insofar as, while the international community was aware of the citizenship problem, as evident in numerous reports, the agreement was mute on the subject. Indeed, the principal demands of the rebel opposition, led by leaders of Les Forces Nouvelles, Guillermo Soro, was for Gbagbo to abandon the national identification in its current form, revise the constitutional requirements of presidential eligibility, and draft a new law to incorporate long-standing immigrants into the citizenry. These demands were not met in the agreement. The power-sharing formula had minuscule influence on Gbagbo's strong executive authority, and the timetable to implement various provisions in the accord was not respected. As a result, opposition rebels left their superficial posts in the reconciliation government, and the country remained divided. It was not until the two sides met in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, a mediation that was incited indigenously without internal proposal, that legitimate efforts to address the grievances of disenfranchised inhabitants began. Undoubtedly, part of the reason both sides agreed to meet was because they realized that with the French and UN intervention, there was little chance of either side winning the conflict outright. The government also recognized the urgent necessity to restore peace and stability in the country, to fight against the growing rate of insecurity, and re-establish state authority throughout the territory of Côte d'Ivoire. Furthermore, the agreement appeased the rebel forces because it blatantly addressed the issue of citizenship by stating, "The identification of the Ivorian and foreign populations living in Côte d'Ivoire is a major issue, and the lack of coherent identification program and documents attesting of the identity and nationality of the persons can be a source of conflict." To deal with this issue, an audience forain was to be put in place that would allow persons without citizenship documents to appeal to a tribunal in order to receive a national identity card or birth certificate, provided they had witnesses to attest where they lived or were born. In addition to the new ID card program, there were new provisions for a more inclusive voter registration, dismantling of the French and UN buffer zone, and an integration of military and rebel forces. The agreement was signed by both Gbagbo and Soro on March 4, 2007. Despite high expectations, elections did not occur as promised in 2008, but finally were held in the year 2010, the first in over a decade. It was during this election, after being disqualified from the 1995 and 2000 polls, that the favored candidate of many Muslim Ivorians, Alassane Ouattara, was able to run. After a highly contested battle, the former prime minister defeated Laurent Gbagbo. However, Gbagbo refused to acknowledge the results, and conflict briefly renewed. After an additional 4 months of renewed violence, Gbagbo was captured by soldiers loyal to the internationally recognized President Ouattara and was subsequently arrested. Gbagbo currently faces charges from the International Criminal Court, where his trial began in January of 2016. Since assuming office as the uncontested president, Ouattara has significantly stabilized the Ivorian political landscape. Furthermore, Côte d'Ivoire has had exceptional economic performance with the GDP growth of over 20% since 2011. This success was enough to give Ouattara a resounding re-election victory in 2015, and Côte d'Ivoire is currently the second fastest growing economy in the world with a projected growth rate of 8.5% in the next year. My hope with this discussion was to help understand and analyze some of the underlying causes of the Ivorian Civil War. Rather than provide an account of the decisions made by the contemporary actors involved, the historical context which underpinned their actions was analyzed. The major events which eventually led to the conflict include the Ivorian miracle, the economic meltdown of the 1980s, the transition to multipartism, the death of Youfid Bonnet, the introduction of the concept of Ivorité, and the exclusionist, autonomous, or indigenous appeals that followed suit. These events serve to substantiate the central claim that the Ivorian crisis has to be understood from a multi-causal perspective. The economic, political, and social dynamics within the country all worked in tandem to bring about a prolonged civil war. As a result, no single explanation is sufficient in and of itself to explain the violence that occurred. With that being said, it is important for the people of Côte d'Ivoire to learn from their history, just the same as we can learn from their history as well. The country is currently booming, much the same as it was during the miracle, but rapid economic growth seldom lasts an extended period of time. The nation needs to take advantage of the position they are in. The last election was by all accounts the most open in the nation's history, and this political pluralism needs to be further solidified by continuing to develop strong democratic institutions. Furthermore, the nation needs to diversify from the primary commodity sector. This is easier said than done. Industrialization is a capital-intensive process which many indigenous investors lack. It is only through strategic investment strategies that Côte d'Ivoire will become less reliant on primary commodities and mitigate the vulnerabilities associated with this type of dependent economy. Ultimately, despite the fact the nation is only a few years removed from violent civil conflict, there is ample reason for Ivorians to be optimistic about their country's future. Côte d'Ivoire has shown itself to be a stable and vastly prosperous nation before, and it can do it again. However, this time around, it must be based on inclusionary politics and fraternité, not an exclusionary appeal to pure Ivorité. It is by fostering inclusivity and encouraging diversity that Côte d'Ivoire will be able to leverage the scarcest of all resources in West Africa, a broad range of human capital that can transform the economic and social sphere in which Ivorians work and live. Thank you. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast and that you learned something new. My hope is to maybe make it a little bit less formal in the future and have some guests on and have some various conversations about issues in law and business, politics, economics, history, which we just had. If you have any suggestions or would like to submit some research or papers that we can discuss on the show, I'm very happy to do so. Just comment or reach out on social media. We're on all the official platforms, and I hope that we can grow Dorian Daily together as an academic forum rather than a mere monologue of myself talking. Thank you so much, everybody.